Hi everyone, I'm Ashley Nordin, Education Developer here at Blick Art Materials. We're really excited to bring you this Sailboat acrylic palette knife painting technique today. We're going to be using Blick Artist Acrylics with Blick Painting Medium on a stretched canvas with a 2-inch border. So it's perfect if you want to go straight from making your painting to hanging on the wall, or you can frame it if you like. We're going to be using a glazing process followed by a palette knife painting technique to build up a really nice texture and make this sailboat image where we're working from a reference image, and you can see that there's a lovely reflection in the water. So we're going to practice applying a technique where we make a gradient going from dark to light from both ends of the painting, working our way toward the center. And then, like we just discussed, we're going to be using a palette knife technique to build up that really nice texture. You can find all the products that we're using, including the reference image and drawing, on the bundle page, so be sure to check that out while you're watching, and you can follow along with all the materials that we're using here today. The first thing that you're going to want to do to get started is make a quick sketch. And it doesn't have to be incredibly detailed because you do lose the drawing as you start to paint over it. So remember that the drawing is just a guide for you to go by to help get you started. So if it's not perfect, no worries. We've provided this simple sketch for you on the bundle page that you can use to do a very simple transfer process using graphite transfer paper. All you have to do is cut that graphite transfer paper to size. You're going to lay it graphite side down on your canvas, put your drawing right side up, and then use a graphite pencil to quickly go over that sketch. Use a little bit of pressure and you should have what looks exactly like this when you're all done with that transfer. Okay, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to practice that glazing technique, and I'm going to be using the Blick Wonder White brushes. So this is a very easy beginner's painting technique that, if you're just getting started, is wonderful to jump into to really get the hang of what acrylic painting feels like. We're going to be using an analogous color palette, so different colors of blue, and we're going to set up our palette here. This is palette paper, so it is disposable. Makes it incredibly easy to use, and I like to tape it down. So these analogous colors, that means that they are situated close to each other on the color wheel so that you don't get mud, basically. And we can blend these colors together to get all kinds of beautiful gradient blues. So this is the cerulean blue. We're also going to use a brilliant blue, and you can notice the subtle differences between these colors, but you can also see that they're going to work really nicely together. Now, acrylic paint is fast drying, so you do want to work somewhat quickly. I'm going to use a cobalt teal here. This is a great alternative to using, say, green, which might be a little too powerful for the image that we're using. So we'll get those set up on the left side of the palette. And then when you're painting, particularly with acrylics or oils, not necessarily with watercolors, you're going to use a lot of white. So I've got a large white tube here that I've been using, and we're going to get plenty of white, a little bit more than our other colors, on our palette. Make sure your caps are on tight so that paint doesn't dry out. I'm also going to use a buff white. And this is a parchment color that you can use to tint your white so that it's not always bright white all the time without having to add black, which will make gray. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of this buff white. Great mixing color to add to your palette. I use it quite often. And then we've got our ivory black, and we just want a little bit of this. We're not going to use too much. I'm going to keep it down here, kind of off to the side, so that it doesn't muddy up the rest of my palette. We're going to have other colors, but just minimally, so let's get started with what we have. I'm going to go ahead and use a Blick Artist Acrylic Matte Medium for our glazing process. And a glaze is basically another way of saying a thin layer, right? So we're just going to add a thin layer. It can be transparent. So if you think of a glaze that you might use in baking, then you might be able to kind of see it in your mind's eye what that's going to look like. So I've added a little bit of that matte medium, but another quick tip for acrylic painters out there to help keep your paint open, I'm taking a pipette and I'm just adding a couple drops of water. I don't want to add too much because with acrylics, water is a thinner, and if you add too much, then it's going to really cut your paint down, probably a lot thinner than you want it to be. But if you want that paint to stay open, in other words, not dry out or develop a skin on top, then just a couple drops of water can really help to ease the mobility of the paint. And that's all you want, is to make the paint a little bit easier to deal with. When it comes out of the tube, it's pigment loaded, it's more like a paste. And adding a little bit of water and a little bit of medium helps to give it that vehicle that it needs to really get moving. So this is my ultramarine blue where we're starting. I'm going to go ahead and bring white into the palette right away. And I'm also going to mix down some of my other colors, because once we start applying this, we're going to want to let our colors work together and blend. So a little bit of white, a little bit of water, and a little bit of matte medium, just to get going. All right, and I'm using my largest brush. So when you're picking out your brushes and your palette knives, it's always important to stick to the right size and shape for the space that you're painting. Now, we're going to work with our darkest colors on top. So let me just unload some of these lighter colors. And I always like to have some paper towel here so that I can clean my brush between colors. And let's start with the darkest on top. And just go ahead and start painting. It feels so good to get your paint going on the canvas. Just the feeling of putting that brush down, it just feels so good. So you are going to cover up a little bit of your drawing, but don't worry about that, because these squiggles just represent where we want the paint to go. It helps us to remember where we're going to put things. So we know that there are some wispy clouds there. Okay, and if we cover it up a little bit, no problem. You're going to see very soon that we're going to, when we get started on our palette knife painting technique, we're going to incorporate a somewhat abstract painting process to help these shapes come to life. Now use your dark to light, but avoid the sailboat, because we want to keep that bright white. So if you're going to cover up anything, let it just be the clouds, and you're going to paint right up to the horizon line. I want to quickly look at this. Your horizon line is right here, almost smack dab in the middle. Okay, so that's where we're going to go dark to light and dark to light. So you're going to leave that little space there. All right, so let's keep moving. I'm just going to paint around the sailboat. And this is a filbert brush, so it's not a perfect square or a perfect rectangle. It's really nice for getting around these curved edges. And that's where I'm talking about, you know, using the right brush shape for your piece. Same thing on both sides. It doesn't have to be perfect. So this part of the process is just a guide to help you get liftoff for the final part of the process, which I think is the fun part. It's all fun, right? But the really fun part is the palette knife painting. So let's get this worked in. Again, you're gonna just go right around the edge. And there's no one way to use a paintbrush, right? So we can use our paintbrush to go back and forth, but we can also use it to gain these really nice edges and get around a curve. And you can see how these colors are already working together so nicely. They're not combating with each other for color space. Instead, they're working together to make some unity. Now, if you want to brighten even more here at the horizon line, you can pick up a little bit of white and a little bit of glaze and work that in. And while the acrylic paint is still workable before it's dry, you can do as much of this color blending as you like. And I would suggest making this underpainting work as a guide for that next step. And so if you're a beginner out there, you're thinking, well, what's an underpainting? I've never heard that before. The underpainting is the part of the painting that you put down to tone your surface. That's it. Maybe that's a one color glaze that you put all over. Maybe it's, like we're doing here, we're picking up some different colors and putting those down. It's that first layer of painting that you use as a guide. So now let's get started on the water. And we know that we want this lighter color here at the top. So right underneath the sail. Oh, and you know what? Before we do that, don't forget this middle part between the sailboat. So if you're looking at your reference image, these little spaces can really help to sell where your setting is, right? So being able to show that little bit of air space between the sails helps to sell that imagery. Now, let's get this dark layer down too. And to do that, we're going to want to use a little bit of black. I'm going to take some more glaze. I'm going to bring it down here with the black. And if I want my darkest blue, I'm going to take my ultramarine blue from the top. I'm going to mix it with my black. If you want to darken or lighten, you use black and white. Easy as that. Okay, and that's going to go on the bottom and get this really nice kind of midnight blue color. And that goes about, I don't know, let's call it a fifth of the way up the painting. Okay, let's get it on the other side here. We're going to continue with a nice gradient. And you notice in the reference image that the very bottom of the painting is much darker than the very top. So that's why we're using black to help make this shading a little bit darker than the top. And make sure you're working around the reflection. We've got this nice kind of outline around the reflection. All right, now let's keep working our way back up to the lighter colors like we were doing prior to that. And they're just going to keep blending. And yes, you're losing a little bit of that sketch, but that sketch was just to tell us where these colors needed to go. It wasn't to be so specific as to only adhere to that as a guide. And when you're painting, the painting process really is a drawing process. So you never stop drawing once you get that sketch down. So think about that when you're using your paintbrush, you're actually still drawing. So the more you practice your drawing skills and practice using your paintbrush as a drawing tool, the better you're going to get at painting. Easy as that. Okay, and we're almost there. Working our way up to the top where it's nice and light. And here in the reflection, we have these little areas where the water overlaps the reflection. Okay, and then again, right here in the middle, and maybe we want a smaller brush for that middle piece there. Okay, so let's take a smaller round brush that's a little more suited to this size. And hold my hand steady. You can also use a maul stick for a more traditional hand steadying technique. That's M-A-H-L, maul stick. And if you're using a long brush, long-handled brush, then that process, that tool might really come in handy for you. All right, how easy was that? Now we've got a lot of information down. So let's keep going while we have our colors out and they're still open. Let's go ahead and paint in our sails and reflection, because why not? Let's use another round brush. This is a size 8, and we can get a little more glaze. Of course, you can use a palette knife to apply your glaze onto your palette. I'm kind of just digging right in. But you do want to be careful not to muddy up your matte medium too much if you've got color on your paintbrush. A clean brush can be dipped into that medium, but be a little bit more wary if you have color. So this is where we're going to leverage our buff white, that exciting mixing color. I know it doesn't look exciting from the outside, but once you get to using it, I think you'll share my love of this kind of, it's almost a warm gray in a sense, but it just gives you enough of that off-white experience to not be that out of the tube titanium white color. All right, now let's go ahead, paint that right in, and it just helps to cover up that white on the canvas. People always ask the same question when it comes to acrylic painting or painting in general, and that question is, how do you know if a painting is done? Well, we could debate that all day and night, but I will tell you one way that you know a painting is done is when all the canvas is covered. So by that I mean all that texture that you see in the weave. If you leave any of that blank, that is one of the things that makes a painting look unfinished. So it's important to use colors and not just leave canvas white when you see white in your image, to make sure that you're covering all of that space. And you can already see that going to work. So let's get the other part of the sail. This round brush is just the right size to apply pressure, and see how I'm fanning it out. It's not just a paint, 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 right? You want to use the brush in all its glory and apply pressure and lift. All right, so that's the perfect color for the sailboat. Maybe we want just a little bit of variation for the reflection. And if we're continuing to look at our reference image, you can see that it is just a little bit darker. It's not going to be that bright parchment white that you see on the sail. So let's go back to that buff white. I'm going to get a little more glaze. Okay. The glaze is less of a thinner, or I'm sorry, the matte medium is less of a thinner than water. So that's why I'm using it here, because it doesn't break down the paint as much. So we want our layers to be strong. We want them to have great adhesion. We want to reduce crazing. That's probably one of the #1 items there, is crazing. Well, what's crazing? I'm crazing. You're crazing. We're all crazing. Just a little joke there for you, but No, crazing is when a little bit too much water gets added to your paint and it starts to crack after it's dry. It starts to separate because the paint wasn't strong enough. The water was too much of a thinner. So just like mineral spirits can thin a paint, that's what can thin an oil paint. That is what water is doing to your acrylics. So only use it sparingly. Use it to keep your paints open. Again, when acrylic paint starts to dry, it gets a film on the surface, and that film is useless. You got to toss it. You have to take away the skin to use the good paint underneath. So the longer your paints sit out, the more susceptible they are to developing that skin on the surface. Okay, we're just going to... Now I could use a smaller brush here. It's totally up to you, but I've got all my paint loaded up on this one. So I'm just going to stick with it. I'm going to help sell my imagery by filling in those little wavy areas. And you can see, this is what I'm talking about. I don't know if you can see this close, where there's a little bit of white still showing. We've been painting and painting and painting away, but you really have to work to get the paint into the canvas. Weave. You have to work and work and work it. Okay. Let's deal with our horizon line. Let's connect our sailboat to the, all right. Let's deal with our horizon line and our sailboat. Since we have been working in white so much, let's stick with that for the time being. And let's use a bright white. And you can see how setting up your palette this way gives you an advantage to color mixing. I have plenty of space to keep my colors away from each other where I need to, or blend them where I need to. I'm going to make sure this is good and mixed. My paint's been sitting out for a little while. It might be starting to dry out, so we want to make sure we're working quickly. That is one of the advantages to working with acrylics, is that it dries so super fast, but you do have to be aware of it as you're working. Okay, and we're going to use this bright white. And again, maybe you're thinking, well, if my canvas is already white, especially if you're a beginner, if my canvas is already white, then why don't I just leave the sailboat white? But you will definitely see a difference if you were looking at the two paintings side by side and one was painted, excuse me, one was painted white and one was left blank. You would think, okay, now I can see that this looks unfinished. I need to make sure that there's paint applied to help it look done. It's part of the doneness. Okay, now we just have one little part left for our underpainting. Then we're going to get to the fun part, which is palette knife painting. We're really going to slather on that heavy body paint and make a wonderful texture that makes our piece look both abstract and whimsical at the same time. So at our horizon line, we have kind of a gray-green, and I think you can put as much thought into that as you like, but I really liked the idea of using this cobalt teal as a replacement for green and mixing it with a little bit of black. And we're just going to get this kind of gray green, and you might need a little more black. I think I want just a hair more black. I'm always careful when I'm using black paint because it does tend to do a lot of work from a color mixing standpoint. So you don't always need a lot of it. We know we need a hefty amount of blue and white, but you may not need as much black. So just something to think about when you're out there setting up your palette. Make sure it's good and mixed. All right, and we could go darker, but I think this is okay. Has a nice green tone to it. And I'm going to use this flat brush. And we're just going to set in our horizon line by making a nice brush stroke that goes all the way across. All right, easy enough. So there's your underpainting. Simple as that. Okay, you want this layer to dry, and you want it to be good and ready for the next step. So good news is that we have one dry here for you, and we can move right into the next step of the process. Now, we can keep the paints right here on our palette. And I'm going to use this modeling paste, and you can see that I've really been going for it with this texture, because you can use as much or as little of the modeling paste as you like. It doesn't necessarily mean that you know, when it's dry, it's going to have the same level of texture. You're going to see it's really, really fluffy when we first put it down, and then as it dries and the moisture wicks out of it, it's flattens and adheres to the surface quite a bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep this same piece of palette paper. I don't think that we need to change that up. And make sure we can, there we go. Really gonna go for it. There we go, lots of modeling paste. You might have some still coming out of the tube there. All right, now let's get to the good stuff. Okay, so I have here a style 22 palette knife. This one's a little nicer. You can see how much I love this shape because the handles are all worn out. So here's one that looks bright and shiny. These have a wood handle. They're absolutely beautiful to look at, but they're even better in use. So I like to have a couple of these on hand. We're also going to use the style 109, which is another multi-use palette knife. It's good for scraping in different directions, or making hash marks. You'll see how we're going to use this one just very briefly later on. So let's go ahead. I think we need a little more paint. Let's go hard on the paint and get more of this ultramarine blue. Don't hold back. And we're going to take this modeling paste, get a good amount of it, as much as you like or as little, depending on how much texture you really want in your piece. And we're going to mix this in the same place as we did before. We're going to use the same color mixing process as we did before, and we just practiced it, so we have the muscle memory to do that very same thing, right? So let's get this going. Let's make sure we have our next colors ready. So let's get a little bit of this mixed in. And again, these colors are similar enough to where if and when they blend, they just go really nicely together. And this modeling paste might add a little bit, it might make your paints a little bit lighter. It's not like adding white. It's not a pigmented modeling paste, but what it's doing is it's actually cutting down the amount of pigment in your mixture. And that makes it look a little bit lighter. But that's okay. When it's dry, you'll see that it all continues to work together. Now let's get a little bit of this white. I think we're going to need some of that. You can see we've already put all that modeling paste that we put down to work. All right. Now, if you've ever frosted a cupcake or frosted a cake, or if you'd like to, this is the process for you. Let's start with our darkest color. We're going to load the paint up, load it up on our palette knife, and we're just going to spread it out, just like if you were frosting a cake. And you might need to move your canvas around to help you get more leverage, but that's one of the reasons, leverage on the canvas, that's one of the reasons that I like using this 2-inch cradle border, because it just is easier to handle this kind of heavy-duty painting process. So it sits up a little bit higher as you're working. I mean, aside from the fact that it looks nice, you don't necessarily have to frame it, you know, all that good stuff, but it also just has a nice height to it, so that when you start putting down the paint in this way, it makes it a lot easier to deal with, I think, as opposed to using, say, a canvas that maybe only has like a 7/8 inch border. You know, that's great. It's a lot easier to frame, but you don't necessarily get the same leverage. I can use the same palette knife for all these colors. I don't necessarily have to switch it out, just like with our paintbrush, right? Now let's get some of this white. Make it nice and light down here at the bottom, where it meets our horizon line. And I love this palette knife shape because it's really easy, just like with our brush, to get around these edges. And it's not going to be perfect yet. We'll get it to perfection or doneness later. All right, let's wrap this up on the other side. And hopefully I'm not blocking the view by kind of, okay, reaching around here. All right, and then there's one little itty bitty part right in here that we don't want to forget. Scrape and scoop with that palette knife. It's like using a little paint shovel almost. Okay, once you've got your paint covering your surface, I'm going to clean this off a little bit. You can just use water, like with a brush. Palette knives, if you've never used one before, are very similar to using a paintbrush, and if you try and keep that in mind, it'll make the process much less intimidating to help you get started. Let's get this out of the way since we're putting this paper towel to work. All right, now let's put some texture on here that doesn't make it look so kind of all over the place. I'm just going to use this palette knife brush stroke, is what I call it, and we're going to work in this texture. Just helps to unify the texture here because it is kind of an abstract piece. You know, it's not fully abstract because, you know, we're not just using shapes to make a feeling. We've made shapes to look similar to something, but not so much so that it has to be an exact replica. So we're painting the idea of something. So again, if you're a beginner and you're thinking, well, I really struggle with making imagery. I really struggle with that drawing part of the painting process that she was talking about before. Well, then this is a great way to dive in because we're not trying to make it perfect. We're just trying to make it unified and done and look like it makes sense, right? Look like something. Now, I kind of like to, well, not kind of, I like to clean my palette knife in between colors because sometimes that leading color can cover up that gradient. So in other words, if I go straight from the dark blue to the light blue, I might cover up that white. So if you wipe that palette knife down in between colors, go ahead and do that. If it makes it easier to manage from a color standpoint. And the other thing that I like about this process, because we did do an underpainting, when we make this texture with our palette knife, sometimes we can see through just a little bit to the canvas, but we don't have to worry because we already painted it. So we're not leaving anything undone. We're not leaving anything unpainted. All right, let's take that little bit of, okay. Now how easy was that? Now go ahead and do the same thing here, right in the middle. Get that texture in. Whew. I like the way this is looking already. Let's keep with the blue colors because they're still open on our palette, and let's do the water. Same process that we used when we made our underpainting. Let's keep with that. We have the muscle memory for it. Okay, we practiced it once before. We can do it again. I'm gonna get more color down here. Plenty of color. Make sure I've got plenty to work with. And don't forget, we have that really dark color at the bottom, so we're going to need more black. And we add that down here. All right. Don't skimp on the white. Get that white going. You're going to need it. More modeling paste. Okay, keep that modeling paste flowing, guys. You can use any brand of modeling paste, okay? It doesn't have to be this exact one, but if you're wondering about it, go check out the bundle page because you can find the reference image, the supplies, everything that you need to be successful to be an excellent acrylic palette knife painter. You will find it there. All right, gonna just quickly clean this off, and you know what? I'm gonna just fold this over so I have a clean side to work with. Get that economy out of that piece. All right, now same process, modeling paste. Maybe you want to use a different amount of modeling paste for the water than the air. Maybe you want to use the same. Maybe you want to change up that level of texture. It's not going to be a huge difference, but it might be enough, you know, for you to want to experiment with. I think, you know, when it comes to painting mediums, use the amount of medium that you're comfortable with, but know that you can always adjust it. You can use more or less, and it's going to cut that paint down a little bit differently each time. But you don't have to be so conservative. All right, and let's take black, and I'm going to add it up here. All right, we've got that nice dark color that we can start with. I think we need more modeling paste. Ooh, let's get it going. All right, you do want to make sure that it is fully incorporated. With mediums, I think what you don't want to end up with is, you know, areas of paint that are all medium, you know, or all paint. You want that to be incorporated. Let's start with the darkest on the bottom. A little more of that black. There we go. some nice texture here. Let's get this down first, and be careful about where you place this down. Don't get too excited and slather it over your underpainting where we know we want our reflection to go. Okay, and then you're going to work in a gradient again. Going to get this down. Use your palette knife to fill in those little spaces. And we do want to be able to tell the difference between the sky and the water. So maybe all of your colors in the water are just a little bit darker. I think that makes sense. Okay. Get this. All right. Use the shape. Now we're working our way back up to that lightest color. So you get your white, got a little bit of modeling paste left. All right. Work it in. Palette knives are great for mixing paint. Probably easiest to use with your acrylics and your oils. I haven't found them to be extremely easy to use with watercolor unless you're using a large amount of that watercolor. All right. And you got kind of this spongy, ready to go paint here. We've almost got it all down. Last little bit. We're getting really good economy out of this Blick Artist acrylic paint. A little is going a long way. So if you are looking for that economical paint brand and a very economical way to start with acrylic painting, I highly, highly recommend this process and these paints. It's just going to make starting out so easy for you. All right, just gonna kind of spread that out. Now let's not forget that we want to sell it with that little space in the middle. Get that filled in and use your palette knife to give it a little texture right down the center. A little more. And we're ready to put that texture back into the piece here. All right, let's get that palette knife cleaned. A little bit of water, nothing special. No mineral spirits needed with acrylics, none of that. And let's do that same palette knife brush stroke. Palette knife mark making might be a better way to put that. And I love how the blue gradient really unifies this piece. Just gives it a really nice feeling for that abstract vibe that we're going for. All right. And maybe you have a different mark that you want to make in your modeling paste texture. I like this one because, well, it's easy. And, you know, why not make it easy? It's not just easy, but, you know, it's enjoyable. It's unifying the mark making process. And sometimes with painting, you know, we think it has to be hard. Or, oh, that's so complex. But I think this kind of helps to dismantle some of that. That it can be easy, it can be simple, and it can still look professional. And that's what we're going for. Professional eloquence. All right, and then let's do that here in the middle. So we know that's all water, and look how close we are to bringing this painting home. All right, now let's finish our sailboat. Let's do the same color combination as we did before. We're going to use the white and the buff. And I'm going to unload this modeling paste again. Get plenty of it. We're really close. And I'm going to get a different palette knife just in case that one needs some time to kind of get clean in that water. Let's add more of this buff white. And be careful to make sure that white is nice and clean. You don't want the blue to muddy up your mixture. And this is about a 50-50 white to buff ratio. And then you can use, just buff for the reflection. And we're going to do a little special technique when we get to the reflection, where we kind of blend the blue and that parchment color while the paint is still open, i.e. it's not totally dry. All right, this is pretty good. Now let's take this, and we want to be careful when we load this up to make sure it goes only where we want it to. Okay, be careful. You can always fix it, but just apply it carefully and you'll have a much easier time. That's why we have this really nice little point on the end of the Style 22 palette knife that helps us to get into some of those tight corners and spaces. And that just really easily covers that space. You can use the same mark here. I'm going to use the same mark because I like the way that it pulls the painting together with a nice unified texture. So let's do that. There you go. We can make short spurts or long strokes. Oh gosh, we're getting so close. I love seeing a painting come together. I want to make sure that these edges meet without necessarily crossing over. Okay. All right, now let's get this smaller sail worked in. Use as much of that as we have left. Get that mileage out of that paint. Work it in. Spread it to cover the surface first. Edge to edge. Okay. And this one I like to go this way and then this way. Gives it a little bit of a different shape. Just a little bit. All right. Now, let's go ahead with the reflection. And we're going to use the buff color. I think we've got plenty actually here on our palette from before, but it's without white added to help tell a difference in light. Helps to convey that it's not all just one big sailboat sinking into the water. It's actually a reflection. And it's a little bit different with its shape, so we might be a little more careful with how we get that down, but I can still apply it here. Apply it here. Now here, we can do a little bit of blending with the blue that's already there. Let me get it spread out, make our job easier. Always want to make our job easier. Okay, now here we just touch a little bit of the blue on either side. And doing that brings it in to the reflection just enough to where the reflection and the water become the same. That's just a little technique you can do, just a little bit of blending, right? Not too much. We don't want to smear it all over. But it's helping to tell the story that the reflection is in the water. Just a little bit. Just for fun. All right, let's get the other side. Oh, I think we have enough here. I think we can make it. I'm gonna dot that in carefully. I don't want a big mess. We're so close. We're gonna wrap it up soon here with finishing up the sailboat and the horizon line. And look at that, how we just get the reflection. I just love that. Done, right? All right, last but not least is our actual sailboat. I want to make sure I have a bright white available. So let's hit the white there. And let's get a little more modeling paste. Oh, how I love this modeling paste. It's Texture Town. All right. This is why I'm saying, if you're working quickly and you're, working with these drying times, it is nice to have a couple of extra palette knives on hand. So if you're shopping for palette knives and you're thinking, how do I pick out a good set of palette knives? Well, try a couple different shapes, see how you like them. I like the Style 22 because it's useful for almost every type of mark making technique because its shape is so versatile. So I recommend, if you're just starting out, starting with that one. Let's get this down. Yep, it's going on really nicely. And you do want to be careful, that you don't disturb that beautiful texture that you just made. Keep it tidy as possible when you're painting, which is not always easy, but we try. Okay. All right, and I'm getting quiet because we're really close. I don't want to mess it up. So if you're painting along, I'm sure that you're feeling both the suspense and the glory of almost being done with a painting. So get that worked in. How easy is that? Just getting the idea of the shape. Good enough. Let's work in our horizon line. And actually, before we do that, nope, let's stick with the plan. Then we'll do our finishing touches right after that with our Style 109. Didn't mean to throw you off there. We're gonna stay the course. It's always the best course of action. All right, let's go back to that gray-green that we loved with the cobalt teal. It's still open on our palette here, and we still have black. We might need a little more modeling paste just to wrap this up, but it'll probably be the last time that we go back to that tube for more, at least for this painting. But in the long run, I hope that you incorporate mediums in your acrylic painting artwork because, well, it just gives you a much better painting economy. You know, you're not just using that paint right out of the tube. That's not going to work. It's just not going to work. You got to get that medium going because it can alter the body of the acrylic. That's what we're looking for. You know, we just want to alter the body of the acrylic to make it a little more, well, like we just did here. We used one medium to make it thinner and one medium to make it thinner. Wait, did I say that right? Use one medium to make it thicker, one medium to make it thinner. So that's the name of the game. You know, you don't have to settle for what comes right out of the tube. You know, you can change it to fit your needs. Now this is a really tight space we're going to work in, so just do your best. You know, don't sweat it. Do your best. Try not to disturb the other layers of paint. It helps to not have too much paint on your palette knife. You know, use that little edge. And it does take some practice to figure out, you know, how to load that paint on your palette knife to make sure it's going to work in the space that you planned it for. I love using palette knives, so I've practiced and practiced and practiced. And so if you're a beginning painter, don't be discouraged if your first painting doesn't turn out. You know, painting is a learning process just like everything else. And the only way to get better is to practice and to make a plan, just like we did here. We made a sketch, we made an underpainting, and we made a texture. And that's what helped us to get to this point. Now, finishing touches, and then you're off to the races. You're going to be painting in no time. I can just feel it. I know that you're out there with a burning desire to get started painting, and so I won't keep you much longer. I'm going to wrap this up. I think I've already got some alt blue there with just a fun little Style 109 palette knife technique. This is a cadmium red medium. You can use cadmium free as well. I like this cadmium red medium. It just has that bright punch about it that I like. And I'm just gonna dot it in. Okay, and then I'm gonna take blue. Well, let's make sure our palette knife's clean. I might have some red still. We're running out of space. All right, let's get our blue and ta-da! You're all done. There's your palette knife painting. Those Blick Artist acrylics are really going to work. We used a medium and we got this really beautiful texture, and look how fast it was. Done. Well, I really hope you enjoyed this demo. I hope you're out there ready to get started painting. Go check out that bundle page for a free reference image, and check out all these supplies that we used here today. And we hope to see you again in our next demo.